Hello everyone, you got Marcel here. Today's video is probably going to be a bit of a long one. We'll see how it plays out. I like to psychoanalyze myself from time to time. I have a tendency to be a bit harsh. We are our own worst critics, right? I share it to sort of give a new perspective. Mistakes that I have made and things that I've been through. It somewhat coincides with a video I requested Sandman make for me. He called it Monkey Branching Men. He did an excellent job. I'll put a link to it down below. If you haven't heard of him, I recommend checking out his channel. I'm going to give you a deeper understanding in the way that I see the world, or at least how I did when I was growing up. How I interact with people and why it differs from the average. It may even be a unique perspective. To set the tone, I'm going to share a concept I've been working on. Let's say that all men are born with a wrench, a sword, and a pen. This is purely an analogy, of course. With these three tools, a man can choose how to interact with any situation. The pen may represent social interactions, dealing with people and culture. With this, he can socially extend his power beyond that of his reach. Perhaps like a politician, in a positive sense. With the wrench, men can build societies. In the small scale, they can work with things around them, tinker, create, perhaps even break things down to understand them better, to analyze that which is around them. And finally, with the sword, they can use it to protect their own society, or even to destroy others. Tear down what their enemies have built to claim for their own. Granted, that's on the macro or large scale. On the micro scale, it could be one-on-one interactions, small things, individuals. These tools are interchangeable to a degree. Sure, you can use a pen as a tool, a weapon. Words can be weapons quite easily, right? Social interactions can be twisted to one's defense or an attack very easily. The same could be said of a wrench and a sword. You can use any one of those tools in any situation and with varying degrees. A kid confronted by a bully, for example, may choose to confront the bully socially. This could be either shaming the bully, perhaps snitching on them, or bringing other friends to their defense, maybe being cool enough to avoid the fight in the first place. It's all social tools that the kid could use. Perhaps they could use their intellect and don't automatically think that that's the right answer because it involves intelligence. But for example, they could tear down the situation mentally and find the best escape route, find the best way to win psychologically, and that may be an example of using the wrench. Finally, they could use the sword and just clobber the guy. So what's the right answer? Truthfully, there isn't one. The sword is useless if the person being picked on is much smaller and weaker and incapable compared to the bully. They're gonna get the crap kicked out of them. Well, perhaps the pen. Not necessarily if the person doesn't have any friends or doesn't have the social clout and understanding in order to wield it to their favor. Perhaps the teachers or the authority don't care that they're getting picked on. Finally, the wrench. Is it possible to outsmart or to better understand the bully through that scenario? Not always. Not every bully is a stereotypical idiot. Some of them are quite smart. So what am I talking about with all of this? What's the point here? The answer of which to choose and how to interact with others is a generally intuitive question. By that I mean that it's automatic, the response that people have when they come in that kind of a scenario, or any scenario. Perhaps with some degree of trial and error. They simply know and respond on what they should do. And this, gentleman, is where I had a deficiency when I was growing up. Now you see, I was fully capable of understanding how all three of those techniques worked, but the part of me that would tell me which one to use or how to use it was missing, or at least was very weak. Now, I wouldn't say as far as that any of the tools themselves are broken. I know how to fight. I'm capable of understanding interactions and things around me, people around me. But there's a part of me that's very socially related that is missing. Looking back at it at that time, I was just an awkward kid. It happens. Perhaps for the sake of our analogy, we could call it the instruction manual. That was what was missing from my toolkit. But the nice thing about it is that you can use any one of those tools you want in any situation. So no one was stopping me from using my wrench as nunchucks and my pen as a screwdriver. But when there's a socially awkward kid growing up in this society, especially in my generation, what do doctors always want to do with them? Yep, you guessed it, they put Marcel on drugs. An exaggerated response, really looking back on it. An example that would closely represent some of the problems that I had. Picture for a moment there was a child, popular guy, right? It's a cool kid. Sticks a lampshade on his head and starts clicking it off and on. And all the kids around him are laughing and having a blast and think he's the neatest thing in the world, right? So then the less popular kid standing next to him sees this happening and thinks, wow, if I do that, then I'll be appreciated and popular too. But they lack the understanding of the social context that's going on. So they hop in immediately after the popular kid is done, put the lampshade on their head as well, and start clicking it off and on and saying, look at me. And nobody laughs. And it makes absolutely no sense to them, as it worked just a moment ago. They only want to fit in. All of my problems when I was growing up could have easily been fixed by a little bit of coaching, a little time, effort put into my socializing, but it simply never happened. I was thrown to the wolves. My parents weren't any help. They were divorced when I was young, and I was left with an overly empathizing mother. She was I wouldn't even say the protagonist in my life. My father was your classic abusive alcoholic. In retrospect, he honestly wasn't that bad. I used his help to build a little discipline, so in some ways I kind of appreciate what he did for me, but at the time it was antagonistic. My mother became the polar opposite of this. She had the philosophy of almost kill them with kindness, and she ultimately became a role model in my life that led me down a very, to be honest, she started to turn me into a cuck. A complete and total simp. But like I said before, the socially acceptable solution in that era, in that time frame, was to put the awkward kid on drugs, not to bother with actually coaching them through their problems. No, they just need drugs. Well, that deadened my senses and made it even worse. I stopped eating, I stopped sleeping, I couldn't focus, I couldn't learn anything, I started falling behind and failing in school. So here comes another doctor. Marcel is losing too much weight. Here, give him these Ensures and breakfast drinks and stuff. You guys want to guess what was in what they were giving me? Soy and sugar. Hundreds of years from now, people are going to look back on that kind of medical practice and think it's the equivalent of having a crazy person there and deciding to bash a hole in the side of their head to let the demons out. Those kind of treatments don't actually work. They don't help the child, they don't help them socially, they don't help anything. And they made the situation far worse for me. My mother, as my father was out of the picture at this point, caught on to this fact, but not soon enough before some damage had already been done. I had lost the ability to use any of my tools intuitively, and the most critical time in my life when I would have been able to wield them and strengthen them was dampened. Wasted because teachers didn't want to have to deal with me. Doctors that wanted to sell me pills. Well, what's a young Marcel to do? The only tool that I had that was particularly strong, you see, socially I was broken, and then physically I was weak, incapable of defending myself. All that I had was my wrench. I had to analyze and outthink every situation, be it romance, fights with students, whatever it was. I had to think my way through it. My mind was sharp, if nothing else. If that sounds like a positive thing, I assure you it's not. The proper response is to actually have a balance of all three. I was never afforded that opportunity. Besides that, using a wrench is often the safest choice, because for one to try and bring social attention to what's happening can be devastating if they're in the wrong. Furthermore, swinging punches can just, you don't want to do that at the wrong time. So my wrench became hyper-intuned, overdeveloped. Fast forward a few years when I came into the dating scene. Puberty hit early for me, so, women became a very large part of my life. But how did that play out for me? As you may suspect, I hyper-analyzed everything that the women did. When a guy puffs up his chest to impress the girl or takes the time to beat away the guy that's trying to talk to her, these things are intuitive. Sure, a lot of the behaviors that men exhibit are wielded against them, and that becomes very important later in this discussion. Nonetheless, for a healthy relationship, they're often necessary. Well, keeping in mind that I learn everything that I had from the people around me by analyzing them, and I lack the auto responses that would have built into a typical male, once I had been through enough relationships, two things started to happen. Firstly is I developed an expectation of behaviors that the average person might miss for a really long time. Females exhibit patterns. They're obvious enough when you're watching for them, but if you're not, if you're the average guy who's just interested in certain things, you don't pick up on them. The second thing that happened is I was pulled further away from male-to-male interactions that would have helped me develop into an average male in my mindset and behaviors, tying that into the fact that I was being raised by my mother. So these women I was dating ultimately became a very negative and toxic part of my life. I think almost everyone has that experience though. Very few men have super happy relationships, at least on the long term. A couple of very interesting things started to happen with me. For one, by recognizing the behaviors from those women, I was able to predict a lot of what was going to happen before it occurred. I wasn't always right, but I was correct often enough that I was able to pick up on things, behaviors off of certain types of women, and could tell that they would be a compatible match with me, at least to a degree, based on those behaviors, and would pick girlfriends not on how they looked, how attractive they are, but rather on clues about their personality. Furthermore, by spending a majority of my time around women and being so analytical about them, I started exhibiting female behaviors. Now, I'm not talking, pink shirts and soy boy attitudes. It wasn't like that. It wasn't giggles and cuddles either. Just to be clear, more along the lines of the big picture relationship kind of behaviors. I think it was almost an inverse of something my mother had taught me. She always told me, treat others how you would want them to treat you. Well, we all know in the real world it doesn't work that way. I started treating women how they were treating me. I was picking women based on their behavior traits, not on their looks. Thinking of them less as a romantic interest in anything to do with love and more as a resource. Gentlemen, I almost started to exhibit hypergamous behaviors, simply because that's what I was around all the time. It's how I picked up how I was supposed to behave. I studied the people around me, and because of my drive at being male, I was always around women. There was a big time in my life where I would exchange one girlfriend for another just because she was a step up socially. Perhaps not to a degree of how much money she had, but the concepts were the same, just from a different perspective. Girlfriends, at least in some ways, became resources for social validation. You've heard me say in previous videos that I really didn't have much of a type. It wasn't how the women looked, it was different than that. Well, there you go. Now, perhaps some of you might say that that was, too much estrogen production from all the soy and the interactions being raised by my mother, and that's entirely possible. That's a valid analysis of what I was going through at that time. So what saved me? What pulled me out of that rut? See, a combination of society, my mom, my parents to a degree, were trying to program me to become a blue pill cuck. I honestly believe that's the path that I was headed, though I don't think for my parents they were doing it intentionally. But I was broken. The programming wasn't sticking. If I had used a balance of all three tools that we had mentioned earlier, then I would have been screwed completely. But I think that, the nature of things, I was never intended to go down a hypergamous path. That wouldn't have made any sense. And I certainly would never have found the resolution, which is when I developed my wrench so much, when I put that much mental energy into that part of my mind, that analytical nature, eventually, and I want to say that it was in college starting to study psychology. People always say psychologists do what they do to study themselves. There are truths in that. My intellect, which up until that point had been a crutch, it had been a way to survive, that analytical nature got so profound, got so fine-tuned that it doubled back on myself. You see, anybody can be like an armchair therapist. Anybody can analyze other people and make predictions on what they want or what they're doing based on those behavioral traits. But one of the hardest things for people to do, anyone to do, is actually analyze themselves and understand. And somewhere between college and today, that era in my life, My intellect hit a point where I could see my own negative traits, and I was able to realize and recognize everything that I had been doing wrong all of those years, what I was missing. This was a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight. This is one of the reasons why I never had an actual red pill rage. Now, the issues with women instigated it, and when I came across MGTOW and I saw all of this social analysis, it catalyzed it hard. By that I mean it accelerated, it made that learning process, that curve, much faster. Because amongst all the PUAs and MRAs and various other men-oriented groups that have to do with social dynamics, the ones that are truly studying people are the MGTOWs, are us. Everyone else that's working on these kind of social problems are doing it reactively to a society-oriented perspective. You know, your MRAs, they want to see a goal with society. Your PUAs, they want to see a goal in a bedroom. Neither of these paths are necessarily wrong, but for me at least, because I don't want to speak for other MGTOWs, we have a very self-developmentally driven purpose. We reflect on how we behave and how other people behave a lot, to the ends of owning our lives. Not to overuse the analogy here, but, you know, PUAs and MRAs, they're still plugged into the matrix, right? They're still hooking up with and wrapped up in women. They haven't stepped back out of it long enough to really get a clear picture of what's going on, which is why those systems are still vulnerable. You can't see the whole picture until you step back from it for a while. So for me, when I say that I recognize something about female behavior, that they use certain techniques to manipulate men, or they do certain things to men, the reason why I say those things with such certainty is because I've used those techniques myself. I've reflected those traits right back at women to very unusual results. There's a very dark secret in all of that the blue pill man will never fully understand. TFM gets it, Sandman gets it, Howard gets it, all these red-pilled people. Everyone within our community, for the most part, understands. And that falls down on that women do not love men like men love women. They're drastically different. And the reason why I can say that completely and know it as fact is because I do not love women the way that men love women. I realized those behaviors because I carried them within myself. Towards the latter part of my romantically active life, I dated women almost solely on what they gave to me within the relationship, what they did for me, however they benefited me. There really was no feelings of love per se in a traditional sense. I didn't feel it like that. That part of me had long since withered away like a vestigial limb. It was no longer functioning. Some would say I had just been through too many bad relationships, that I had experienced too much pain, and it was causing me to not experience the bonding, the connection that should have been there. But that wouldn't explain the analytical way that I would pick women based upon their resource value, how much attention they would give me, what they would benefit me. We're not talking money in my sense, not necessarily anyway. My priorities were drastically askew, very different, in other words, than the average male. The only reason why I was able to get relationships at all, to not be a complete social outcast, is I was able to pick up on those personality traits and pick women almost the same way that women pick men. And if they left me, or traded me for someone better, or I wanted to trade them for someone better, for example, I felt nothing. I would comfortably monkey branch from one woman to another without any remorse. Or on her end, if she would finally confront me, say to me, Marcel, I'm no longer interested in you anymore, this isn't gonna work, I would smirk and say, okay. See, with the relationship's end, they had worn out their usefulness. This is why I can honestly say it was never really about getting in their pants. At least 90% of it wasn't. Now, does that make me a cold and heartless, a terrible creature? A soulless monster? Perhaps even a predator, by picking women for that purpose to that degree? I'd find that very intriguing. After all, I learned it all from women. Who else would I have picked it up from? Anyway, gentlemen, as I said, this was going to be a very long video. If you've stuck around through all of it, that's impressive. You have an opportunity now to analyze me. Was I just socially awkward? Did I get soyified and cucked? Perhaps I was only behaving naturally, given the circumstances of a very twisted society, rough childhood. You're welcome to put me under a microscope or perhaps share your own story down below. Keep in mind though, that's my past. It doesn't even feel like me anymore. The way I think has really evolved since then. Remember, we can all look at the same situation, the same circumstances, and view it in a number of different ways. Perspectives are a remarkable thing, aren't they? The takeaway from all of this is when you interact in any situation, consider what tools you're using, whether or not they're the best response, and whether or not they came automatically to you. Being able to self-reflect is one of the most powerful tools we have. The next video I'm thinking of making, if it's done already, I'll put a link right here. It's going to be called, most likely Rage, Reflect, and Regroup. Some of the mental processes that I go through, and other people might go through in general, when they have different situations that pop up. More psychological talk, if you're interested. Sometimes I really like to dig into this sort of stuff. If you enjoyed this topic or want to hear more videos similar to it, like, share, and/or subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon. This has been Marcel.